Hello and welcome back to the France 24 newsroom. This is live from Paris. I'm Haxi Myers-Belkin. The headlines. Celebration erupts in the streets of Sudan following the announcement of a power-sharing agreement to end weeks of political deadlock. Sudan's ruling military council and the opposition coalition vowing to take turns leading the country until elections can be held. US President Donald Trump puts on a show of pomp and patriotism during 4th of July celebrations in Washington. Critics accusing him of trying to turn a national holiday into a political rally. And Algeria gears up for a 20th consecutive Friday of anti-government protests. This is the country's interim president, Abdelkader Ben Salah, calls for a national dialogue ahead of delayed presidential elections. Thank you very much for joining us. Also coming up in the programme, donning heels and making a dash for the finish line, dozens take part in the stiletto race at Madrid's Gay Pride. Up for grabs not only the glory, but also a cash prize of €350. A breakthrough in the Sudan crisis, with the country's ruling army leaders reaching an agreement with pro-democracy protest leaders after weeks of deadlock over whether a civilian or a soldier should lead the country's new governing body. Their solution, the establishment of a sovereign council with a rotating military and civilian presidency. A little earlier, I spoke to our regional correspondent Julia Steers about the many question marks that remain.
For Freedom and Change, the protest leaders were careful to frame it as a hopeful development, something that will pave the way for them to establish the structure of the rest of the transitional government going forward for the next 3 years or a little more, as you just heard there. In terms of who will head up the council, we've heard that there will be 5 representatives from each side, civilian and military, with a 6th so-called who is a retired military officer, and then they will appoint a president of the overall council. There are reports that are not yet confirmed, but several reports coming out of Khartoum saying that it is most likely that the military council will appoint the first president of this sovereign council. Of course, that could be problematic for many reasons, mainly if one of the 2 leaders, the head of the military council, Al-Burhan, or the deputy head, a general known as Hamedi, is appointed to the leadership. They are really seen as the old guard, and Hamedi in particular is seen by the protesters as the man who was responsible for the June 3rd massacre that killed over 100 protesters and broke up the protests, calling off these negotiations last month. So certainly there's a sense of waiting to see just how celebratory the reactions should be, and waiting to see who exactly will head up this council. They also have other work to do, so they agreed on the formation of a legislative council, but that will be decided over the course of the next 3 months.
Of 86 migrants aboard a boat that capsized off the Tunisian coast, only 4 have survived, that according to the Tunisian Coast Guard. One traumatized Malian man clung to debris for 2 days before being rescued. He said that his fellow migrants had been from Guinea, Ivory Coast, Mali and Burkina Faso, and that their inflatable boat started to take on water just hours after setting off for Europe from Libya.
These protesters are singing from the same hymn sheet. In unison, the lyrics of La Casa del Moradia ring out. The song began as a football chant at Algerian club Ouled El Beja. Once confined to the stands, today it expresses the discontent of millions of young people in the country. It has transcended football and today is used to berate the establishment and Bouteflika's old guard.
As there was no freedom and protests were banned, the stadium provided the only release for these young people to express their frustration and send a strong message to those who govern us.
El Mouradia is the name of the presidential palace in Algeria, a frequent target for protesters. La Casa del Mouradia is a reference to the Spanish TV series Casa de Papel.
What happened? That report was, in fact, about the origins of one of the protest songs that we're expecting to hear ringing out again in the streets of Algeria this Friday. Algeria heading into a 20th consecutive Friday of anti-government protests, that coinciding with a call for national dialogue by the country's interim president, Abdelkader Ben Salah, vowing that the state and security forces will remain neutral as the country prepares for delayed presidential elections. Now, a story we covered a little earlier of 86 migrants aboard a boat that capsized off the Tunisian coast. Only 4 have survived. Let's take a listen now to one of those surviving migrants from Mali.
Four of us spent 2 days in the water holding on to the boat. We had no food to eat. When we drifted into Tunisian waters, the boat was wrecked. Most chose to leave the boat, but we stayed, and eventually a Tunisian fishing boat came. They got us onto their boat and saved our lives.
Hailing the USA as the greatest political journey in human history, President Donald Trump addressed crowds in Washington to mark the 4th of July against a backdrop of flyovers and parked tanks. Trump not only added his own Salute to America event to proceedings, but also became the first president in nearly 7 decades to address a crowd at the Capitol's National Mall on the national holiday. Critics decrying what they saw as an attempt by the president to politicise the day. Peter O'Brien has the story.
Taking centre stage in the US Capitol, with Abraham Lincoln looking down, Donald Trump has delivered a speech for Independence Day, America's national holiday.
Together we are part of one of the greatest stories ever told, the story of America. Our nation is stronger today than it ever was before. It is its strongest now.
His extensive words praising the military were choreographed with aircraft flyovers and martial music. The event was an addition to the traditional day of celebrations in Washington, which mark the country's independence from Britain. Festivities usually attract hundreds of thousands of people, but this year they drew anger as well, with protests near the Washington Monument.
Donald Trump has hijacked this holiday. Instead of making it a nonpartisan time for the people to come together and have picnics and watch the fireworks, he's turned it into a celebration of himself.
But behind a section for guests, including top military personnel and Republican Party donors, those in the front rows were certainly enjoying the show, despite the rain.
Buildings shook and people were injured by falling debris as Southern California experienced its most powerful earthquake for 20 years. The 6.4 magnitude quake struck at the Mojave Desert, about 240 kilometers northeast of Los Angeles. Emergency crews are still dealing with a number of small fires and reported gas leaks. Peter O'Brien has the story.
Officials in Ridgecrest, a town rattled by Southern California's biggest earthquake in more than 20 years, were giving a news conference when another aftershock hit.
Looking for damage. We were inundated with calls, with fires, and obviously stores that were shaken with stuff falling off the shelves.
There have been dozens of aftershocks since the initial quake.
That's another earthquake.
It caused several minor injuries, and a hospital near the epicenter has been evacuated as a precaution. There have been fires, cracked roads, and several water and gas leaks, while thousands of homes were without power. Throughout the area, people shared their footage and their stories.
The back. At first I thought it was a sonic boom, but it wouldn't stop, so it kept on going and got worse. And I jumped down and ran to go get the kids because it didn't feel right. Things were falling down.
I started seeing the dresser start shaking, and then all of a sudden I realized the walls was moving and everything was just wavy, like I was surfing.
The earthquake was of such high magnitude that it was felt throughout Los Angeles, as far east as Las Vegas, and even south of the Mexican border.
A new report from the UN Human Rights Chief describes the number of alleged extrajudicial killings in Venezuela over the past 18 months as shockingly high. Michelle Bachelet also noting that Venezuelan authorities themselves recorded almost 5,300 deaths during that same period during security operations in cases linked to resistance to authority. Among more than 20 recommendations for the crisis-hit country, ensuring media freedom and the disbanding of pro-government armed groups. A little earlier, we spoke to our correspondent Ana Herrero in Caracas about the response to that UN report there.
In Venezuela, everyone is shocked and more or less relieved that this happened. Finally, the UN is speaking, and it's speaking on behalf of the victims, on behalf of those nearly 4 million people who fled the country, looking for water, for food, and for more opportunities that they can find here in Venezuela. This is definitely something that we weren't expecting. We surely were expecting this report to be harsh on Nicolas Maduro's government, but this was extremely shocking because it really it showed that they did a good research and that they actually heard the voices of the hundreds of victims that wanted to speak with Bachelet and with the team that previously visited Venezuela. Let's not forget that this didn't happen just because Bachelet visited the country. This happened because the UN has been here and listening and researching, also investigating with the different NGOs and organizations that also do different works in the country. And of course, for the opposition, this is something that it's not worthy of celebrating per se. That's maybe not the word, but definitely they are cheerful that once again, Venezuela is under the radar. Once again, the human rights violation and the humanitarian crisis, it's again on the table in the world.
As the country digests the details of that damning UN report, the country's opposition leader Juan Guaidó has called on his supporters to join him for yet another mass rally this Friday against the government of President Nicolas Maduro. That protest coinciding with Venezuela's Independence Day. Our reporters in Caracas spoke to Juan Guaidó ahead of that protest. You can catch the full interview at 8:45 Paris time. Do tune in for that if you can. Dozens of people teetering in high heels have taken part in one of the most popular events at Madrid's gay pride, the stiletto race. The contestants, most of them men, spanned a wide range of ages and fitness levels, but they all had one thing in common. Their heels were all at least 10 centimetres high, and yes, they were being measured by independent adjudicators. Many participants seeing this year's Madrid Pride as a particularly important act of solidarity at a time when political newcomers, the far-right Vox Party, regularly launches attacks on LGBTQ rights. A reminder now of our top headlines here on France 24. Celebration erupts in the streets of Sudan following the announcement of a power-sharing agreement to end weeks of political deadlock. Sudan's ruling military council and the opposition coalition vowing to take turns leading the country until elections can be held. US President Donald Trump puts on a show of pomp and patriotism during 4th of July celebrations in Washington. Critics accusing him of trying to turn a national holiday into a political rally. And Algeria gears up for a 20th consecutive Friday of anti-government protests. This as the country's interim president, Abdelkader Ben Salah, calls for a national dialogue ahead of delayed presidential elections.